Hi guys, welcome back to the internet. Thanks so much for being here. Today I have a really exciting video to share with you, and that is a collaboration I did with my sister Yasmin, who is a really lovely, intelligent, awesome human being. She's a PhD student at the University of Glasgow and she studies philosophy. So I thought it would be really fun and interesting for you guys to pick her brain on topics relating to philosophy, what she thinks about various things, and we had a really interesting conversation. I hope you guys enjoy it. Yeah, let me know if you want to see more stuff like this in the future. And just to comment on the audio, I'm really sorry if the audio sounds a bit ringy throughout. It was my first time using this mic and it was in a new environment. You know, the audio quality will improve as I get used to the new equipment, but that's all I have to say for now. Enjoy the conversation we had, and thanks so much again, Yasmin, for being on my channel. Okay, so you studied philosophy, but you started in psychology.
I did my BA in psychology, and then I did a master's in social psychology, an MSc, and I realized very quickly while I was doing that I hated it so much and I didn't want to keep doing it. My favorite parts were all the theoretical stuff, so I decided to try a conversion philosophy course here in Glasgow, and it was really hard actually in the beginning because it was a completely new way of thinking and reading and processing information. But at some point something clicked and it made a lot of sense to me, and I just ended up falling in love with it. And now I've started my PhD, and I'm in my first year.
Yes. Okay, so what are the main ways you think like psychology differs from philosophy? Because I know a lot of people think psychology is going to be more like philosophy than it is.
Right. Psychology is a lot more applied than philosophy is. I mean, most of the sciences that have come out of philosophy historically are more applied. Psychology, the kind of psychology that I studied was mainly kind of research based, a lot of experimental planning, and learning about statistics and data processing and stuff like that. So it was a lot more technical than I expected. There's also another path you could always take in psychology where you go the clinical route and you kind of train to be a counselor or a therapist, and that's completely different. It's an experience I have not had, but a lot of my friends from undergrad have decided that they wanted to take that route, and are looking for masters and degrees now, trying to become certified as counselors, and that's a completely different experience that I don't think I can talk on. But yeah, I think psychology is it's a lot more technical and a lot more applied, and there's a lot more like statistics and math, and
it's a lot more scientific. Like the method, it's like follows a scientific method. Right?
Yeah.
But so does like analytic philosophy, which
That's
is
true, which is why I like it.
Yeah.
Because it's closer than it's closer to psychology than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said before, I love philosophy because of the theory, and was always my favorite part when I was reading anything for my psych classes, was who thought of this idea, and who kind of like initiated these concepts. But philosophy, the kind of philosophy that I do is very analytic, in the sense that it's very based on logic, it's very systematic, it's very kind of like clear and concise, and very Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah. Okay, so that kind of opens up a lot of ways that things we could talk about. But so I do like Continental mainly, like the kind of philosophy I studied was kind of overlap between Analytic and Continental. I feel like there is a lot of overlap now in like contemporary philosophy between them. It's not as clear cut. Yeah. Although your department is like solely analytic, right? Like you don't study like Kant, you don't study any of the existential French philosophers.
Yeah.
You don't study.
I mean, there is Kant, and there are a few philosophers that slip in. They're kind of.
But you don't study Hegel, for example.
No.
So it's Kant, but not
There's
Hegel.
no phenomenology.
There's no phenomenology at all.
There's none of that.
It's so interesting.
Yeah.
So do you think that there's like a hole in philosophy, or like a missing piece in the kind of philosophy that you study?
I think I want to go back to the fact that I've just started studying philosophy, and we were talking about this earlier. Yeah. And this is my second year doing philosophy, and it is still very new to me. So I don't want to say something and just be like, yeah, this is how it is, because it's probably not the case.
That's already a really good like, philosophical like starting point.
My personal experience with philosophy has been very limited in the sense that I only study certain subjects and it's very contemporary based, so I haven't read a lot of like classics.
Yeah.
But I do agree that sometimes when I am listening to talks or reading papers, I find that it is kind of missing something, maybe like a human element, and I think that's where it kind of, that's one of the like downsides of analytic philosophy, is that it is very like rigid and strict in that sense. But I find that there has been more overlap in recent years with continental topics rather than continental methodology. If you study like perception and philosophy of mind,
there's a lot of overlap.
There's a lot
of continental philosophers like cared about those topics.
But the kind of so what I'm studying is
that's what my next question is going to be. So like what do you study, and like why do you think you were drawn to that, and why do you think that's like an important thing for you to be studying right now?
Great question. So I study gender and race, and those are like my anchor topics.
Yeah.
But when it comes to subdisciplines of philosophy itself, I'm very interested in gender and race from a metaphysical point of view, epistemological, and philosophy of language. So those are my three main kind of areas of expertise, or the areas that I'm trying to train to be an expert in.
Okay, so by metaphysical you mean like the existence of...
So social ontology specifically. Social ontology is the study of kind of
social constructs.
Such as concepts and their existence and how they are constructed, if they are.
Okay, and then epistemology is theory of knowledge, and so how do we know
about these concepts?
Okay.
how can you be justified in your knowledge if there is really knowledge about these concepts?
Okay, yeah, and your department is really big on epistemology.
Yeah, we have an epistemology research center, Cogito, and it's really it's gaining a lot of traction. It's becoming really an important place for epistemology, so it's really cool to be part of that.
That's sick. And then what's the third thing that you said?
Philosophy of language.
Oh, okay. I love philosophy of language.
Yeah,
okay.
and it's very logical.
But you also studied like Wittgenstein.
So there was a little like chapter near the end of my philosophy of language course. I only took one like junior honors class, so I don't have all of the experience. But I do enjoy learning about it. It's just like really, there is a lot of logic involved in philosophy of language, and I found that kind of heavy, but it's also exciting because it's kind of like a futile attempt at making language like scientific and predictable, and it's just not, and I love that contrast. It just makes it really fun because there's all these exceptions. And
oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so how does that your study of languages, because you study Italian, right?
How
does that play into your understanding of like philosophy of language, and how language isn't so rule-based and it isn't like logical?
The philosophy of language that I'm studying, I think, is really connected to the metaphysics of the same concepts. And I think it's really important to distinguish between terms that we use to refer to concepts and the concepts themselves. And then, so I think with languages, you can have kind of a lot of different words for the same concept in different languages. And I find that really interesting, the overlap between languages and how we can express very similar ideas. And then also, of course, the exceptions where you can't translate certain things. That's always been really interesting to me.
Can you give me some examples of that?
I don't know.
Not to put you on the spot.
I mean, in Arabic there are a lot of things that you really can't translate into English very directly. I find that in Italian as well, that I've been studying it for about a year now, seriously, and I think it is sometimes kind of challenging for my teacher to define things for me, because it's not just like looking it up in the dictionary and like there's like an exact word.
There's like a context in Italy where you would say it in certain
places. And I think that
there's a history behind every like saying as well, that maybe you need to know like the story behind like this idiom or something.
And where it's come from. And I think that's really interesting because it can show you how the language can morph and change over time, and it's like always kind of implicated in the concept a little bit. And like if you change the term, you're changing the lens of which you're looking at the concept, and I think that can also be affected, right? And so I think the connection between philosophy of language and metaphysics is really interesting. And there's a specific kind of field in philosophy right now, it's quite new, and they're calling it conceptual engineering. And it's where we're trying to engineer concepts for, you know, our purposes. So our concepts of woman, for example, or man, are they, you know, accurate? Are they doing the work that we want them to be doing? Are they capturing what they need to capture in the world? And I think that connection is really interesting. So
oof, okay, there's so much there. I feel like we veered off the topic a little bit about what it is that you study, and why are you drawn to philosophy of gender and philosophy of race?
I've always been interested in the social world. So when I studied psychology, I also studied social psychology, and I've just always been drawn to that. It's not something that I can necessarily explain. It's just I think it's fascinating the way that the individual kind of behaves in a group, or how they're affected by you know, other people's real or imagined existence around them and presence. And I think as human beings, of course, we're like, you know, essentially we are social beings, and I think it's something that literally we create so much of the world through our socializing, and kind of in correlation with our socializing, and we're able to I think it's kind of optimistic to say that we're also able to change the world, you know, in that sense, to make it better. We often do the opposite, but I think there's also opportunity to make it better. I think my interest in gender and race has been like very personal to my identity. I'm from Egypt, and being a woman, and it's kind of like just a very salient, important part of your identity. It's like gender is so, I mean, it's so important in all cultures almost, and all kind of post-colonial culture, and the way that my gender has affected my experience in the world, I think has been just so massive, right? And I always been interested in how to explain that, and why that is, and whether or not that's a good or bad thing. I think recently I've been struggling with the positives and negatives of gendering in the world, and I can see experiences of people that are less privileged than I am, like trans and non-binary people, who just suffer a lot in such a, you know, binary based world. And it's always worked really well for me, and it's almost like, well, I want it to work for everybody. And so that's why philosophy is a great way, because to kind of like try to change that, or try to help theorize about what we can do, as much as try to change kind of what people think, and how we value these binaries, and how we value the hierarchies, and how we value categorizing people, and why we do it in the first place. I think it's really important to kind of establish whether or not this is something that we can avoid as human beings, where it's come from, and kind of take that as a first step to, you know, further research in the future, hopefully.
No, that's really inspiring, and I love like how you framed that. But I'm wondering what you would say in response to people who might argue against the value of theory over practice. Like, how does theory, in your mind, theory really contributes to our practices in the world?
Well, I mean, I think everything originates as a theory, right? All of our ideas. I don't know if that's an argument, but it's a claim that I'm making, an assumption I'm making. I really think that, I mean, there's no practice in the world that isn't based on theory. Like, it's not very reasonable to act without a reason, right? So, like, if we don't have an idea about how things are, then we wouldn't have a good reason to behave towards them in the way that we do.
Right, but have we always been, like, quote-unquote reasonable, and isn't assuming that people are reasonable an assumption that needs to be validated in itself? Like, who's to say that theories didn't begin with, oh, these are our practices, and now we are retroactively theorizing about them and making them make sense? Like, that's one of the issues of a lot of, like, really intelligent people, and philosophers especially, where they can just, like, retroactively rationalize what it is that they're doing and what it is that they're arguing for, but really underneath that is just, like, incentive, or like power, hunger, desire,
Human
things like
nature.
that. Yeah, human nature at the core of it. So
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think there's a lot of skeptical arguments there that I should probably study and, you know, get back to you on that. But I don't think that it's really possible at the moment for me to tell you whether or not we can know that.
that's
But
fair.
it's definitely an attempt to, I think, kind of basing it off the assumption that we are reasonable is my starting point, but that is a whole other ball game of trying to figure out whether that's even a good starting point. But as an analytic philosopher, that's what I'm gonna assume for the sake of sake of anything.
And that's why I'm really interested in continental philosophy and how that intersects with literature, because I think that literature and poetry especially really can draw you in emotionally, and where reason fails, the emotion and human nature really succeeds, and maybe the integration of analytic and continental methods and forms can be the solution to this kind of issue of creating social change. Assuming that some people are reasonable and others aren't, we can collectively fight the powers.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I'm definitely for an integration of continental and analytic philosophy. I definitely see the value in that. I think it's really important. It's just that my experience in philosophy has been very limited, and as coming from a science, a humanities, but essentially a social science background, I do value the systematic and the scientific methodology, definitely. So I find that once philosophy veers off of that, it starts to be a little kind of difficult for me.
Yeah, it is, and I think that's why philosophy of language is so important, because it really tries to pin it down into something that's foundational, or something that we can then build on. Because when we don't, it's like reading Hegel or reading Deleuze, oh my god, it's so intensely difficult to read because they create their, even Kant, he creates his own terminology where made from previous terminology that was used differently, and he uses it in a different way, and then he builds this whole system. But you have to learn so much new language to be able to talk about what it is he wants to talk about.
I mean, that's also something in common with any philosophy has that. Any kind of philosophy has its own terminology, its own jargon, and its own kind of way of framing things. And I think it's definitely a learning curve, and I haven't been able to really understand and appreciate the detail of which philosophers really study things, because I'm still learning how they're even talking about it, and the words that we're using, and what they mean, and what they refer to. And
I mean, I had professors who spent 10 years deconstructing just one text and trying to understand it, and then help other people understand it. So it's a lifelong journey. I don't think it's something that you can study in a year and become a master of, or anything like that. Even 3 years later, I'm still I've only scratched the surface, but I think I've scratched a broader surface, and maybe you scratch deeper into one specific area.
Yeah, definitely. So, starting in grad school.
So okay, moving on from the conversation, which was really interesting, what about what for you has been the biggest benefit of studying philosophy? What do you think you gained personally from studying philosophy?
I think the biggest thing philosophy has done for me is given me a lot of freedom in a way, because it's helped me accept that skepticism is not a bad thing. It's helped me be more critical of the world around me, and I've always kind of internalized criticism and criticized myself a lot, and philosophy has helped me externalize that, and to see how as much as I have a lot of space to be better, the world also has a lot of space to be better. And that makes you feel better about yourself, because it's I'm not the only one who's doing terribly. Everybody's making all these fallacies all the time. People's arguments are full of holes. It's really, I'm still obviously doing that, but it's just, it kind of humanizes everything, and makes you realize that it's okay not to know everything, and it's okay to kind of keep learning. And also it's okay to change your mind. This is a huge thing that I love about philosophy that isn't really the same in other disciplines, where if you get it wrong, you're just cancelled, you know, like in science, you just gotta retract. But in philosophy, it's like, I don't agree with my past self. Like, a lot of philosophers will be like, well, I don't agree with what I wrote like 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And people respect you for that. They're like, this is awesome.
Yeah.
And I think that we need that so much, especially currently in the world, of just like giving people space to grow and change their minds. And so philosophy's done a lot of great things for me.
Awesome. That makes me so happy. And what do you think has been the most difficult thing in studying philosophy?
Same answer.
Same thing.
I mean, it's not ever one or the other, right?
Yeah.
It's just two sides of the same coin. I think it's also made it very scary sometimes to know that I probably I'm not going to be able to know anything for certain, and that can be a really terrifying, distressing experience. And I've had that recently, where I just realized that my perception of a situation was probably just mistaken and like highly motivated by emotions. And as a really sensitive person that is really into analytic and like trying to find the truth and believing that there might be an objective truth, it's kind of scary because I'm never going to be able to see that because I'm embodied, I'm a human, I've got my perceptive lens on, and that can be terrifying.
Oof,
It's really comforting to believe in something for real and for sure, and to just be like, yes, this is fundamentally true, and like this is just never gonna change. But once you don't have that anymore, it can kind of feel very exposing and distressing. But at the same time, it's very freeing because it can be anything. You know, you've got all this space that opens up for you.
True.
So yeah, it's good and bad.
Yeah. And so do you think that philosophy being like grounded in truth finding is like good for us? Like, I know there's a lot of philosophers that like believe in like skepticism and I don't really know where I'm going with this question.
But yeah, is it important to find truth, you think? Is that your question?
As a living being who like needs meaning, because we are meaning making beings, like finding something that we believe is true is obviously a meaningful experience, which is but that's not really my question. It's more about like collectively, do you think that having a grounding in truth and like a unified understanding of what that is important?
I think it can help us kind of coordinate a lot better and collaborate if we all have the same idea about what the world is and how it is and or how it should be. I think it has a lot of potential for solving a lot of problems, because a lot of people disagree on just like fundamental truths, right? And that's what causes all this conflict and suffering in the world. And I think there's a certain amount of suffering that isn't avoidable, but in our social lives, if we can find something that we all share or that we all agree on, I think that would be a huge step forward.
But do you think it might reduce some, and then we're just getting like complicated, because I'm going to say some truth to like what truth is, like if truth is multiplicitous or multidimensional
or objective
or subjective, like what if like there's cultural truths that don't like span across different cultures or different eras. There's like
I mean in the same line of like, you know, trying to capture this truth or find it or this quest for truth, we're also losing a lot of diversity, right? We're also losing a lot of nuance, and it's kind of I'd like to draw an analogy with language, right? And how people have this argument for we should all be speaking the same language, and that would solve so many problems because we'd all be on the same page. But then we would lose so much of what makes the world so special, and like all of the variation between people and cultures and experiences. And I think that would be really sad if we lost that. So I just think that analogy kind of works for truth too, because, you know, I think there is some sort of relativity to truth probably, but it's really important to consider the context and try not to erase contextual differences, but just like to acknowledge them, I think is a good good place to start.
Yeah, no, that's a really good answer. Yeah, no, I mean, that might be a really good place to end
Yeah.
it on. Yeah, thank you so much for...
No, this was really fun.
Yeah,
Thank you for preparing
you're
this.
so smart.
Oh, you are.
I love you.
I love you so
and
much.
Thanks for being on the channel.
Thank you for inviting me. This was really, really fun. Yeah, I hope I haven't disappointed anyone.
No, I think that was, honestly, it was amazing. It was like beyond my expectations.